New in the last 5 minutes, U.S. sanctions target Russian officials and businessmen in the last half-hour. Saturday papers. Trump imposes new sanctions against Russia. U.S. raises the stakes with tough sanctions on Russian oligarchs in the last hour. Obama and Bush officials praise Trump sanctions on Russia. Obama and Bush-era officials praise new Trump sanctions on Russia. U.S. targets allies of Putin in latest round of sanctions. Trump administration imposes tough Russia sanctions in the last 2 hours. Key figure in Russia's NRA outreach ploy added to sanctions list in the last 4 hours. U.S. administration to announce sanctions on Russian elite. Video. The Russians on the new U.S. sanctions list in the last 6 hours. U.S. slaps new sanctions on Russian individuals, entities. New round of U.S. sanctions target Putin-connected oligarchs, officials. U.S. Treasury Department sanctions Russian oligarchs, companies over malign. Russian embassy decries new U.S. sanctions as erroneous step. New U.S. sanctions target prominent Russian figures. The moral case for sanctions against Russia. Trump's schizophrenic sanctions. Earlier today, in the last 8 hours, U.S. issues new sanctions against Russian officials, tycoons and companies. Russia sanctions highlight need for United States to fight illicit finance. Tom Cotton praises Trump on strong Russian sanctions. Russia vows tough response to new U.S. sanctions. The Russia sanctions list. Who's on the new U.S. blacklist? The Russians on the new U.S. sanctions list. U.S. sanctions hit one of UK's best-known Russian oligarchs. U.S. raises stakes with tough sanctions on Russian oligarchs. Russia promises tough response to U.S. sanctions. New Russia sanctions target Putin insiders. U.S. imposes new Russian sanctions. Deterring Russian hacking will take more than latest sanctions, experts say. Doc of the day. U.S. blacklist of Russian oligarchs. Trump sanctions Putin's son-in-law, but not Putin. Yesterday, fresh U.S. sanctions target Russian oligarchs and companies. U.S. imposes sanctions on Putin's oligarch allies. Sanctioned Russians include dossier figure and banker linked to NRA. Trump-Putin meeting depends on actions by the Russians. Bipartisan bill would sanction Russia over UK poisoning. White House. Trump has been tough on Russia because he said so. Russia vows firm response to new U.S. sanctions. White House quizzed on Russia strains. Video. White House quizzed on Russia strains. Russia's Deripaska calls U.S. sanctions groundless, ridiculous. What's included in the latest U.S. sanctions against Russia? U.S. punishes Russian oligarchs and officials with more sanctions. U.S. lawmakers propose new Russia sanctions over UK spy attack. Media. Russia will respond in tough way to sanctions. U.S. slaps sanctions on Putin cronies for Russia's malign activity. Sanctions on Russian tycoon Deripaska will create global ripples. U.S. hits Putin allies with new sanctions. Russia says it will respond firmly to new U.S. sanctions. Former Obama and Bush officials praise new Trump sanctions on Russia. Moscow says new U.S. sanctions aimed at the Russian people. Prominent Russian businessmen, officials on new U.S. sanctions list. Ridiculous to say Trump hasn't spoken out on specific Russia issues. Bill Browder. U.S. sanctions will hit Putin right between the eyes. American sanctions are getting closer to Putin. U.S. slaps sanctions on key Putin allies. Russia sanctions will not affect Trump-Putin meeting plans. White House. Russia sanctions will not affect Trump-Putin meeting plans. White House. These are the prominent Russian businessmen on new U.S. sanctions list. Russian embassy comments on new U.S. sanctions. Russian stocks deliver sanctions. Facepalm moment. U.S. implements sweeping sanctions against Russian oligarchs. U.S. sanctions Russian oligarchs. Government officials. Russian embassy in USA says new sanctions are a mistake. IIFAX. U.S. sanctions 24 Russian oligarchs and government officials.